Okay, I'm just going to start with some housekeeping, quick intro from my end as people are joining. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Claire Ladd. I'm the Programs and Services Manager at the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, or MNN. And just a few little things before we get into the webinar. The recording and the slides will be emailed to you following the webinar as soon as we have them ready to go. So just keep an eye out for that. During the webinar today, if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat or Q&A. We'll make sure to have plenty of time to answer them. And if you have any kind of technical difficulties or anything like that, just reach out using the chat and we can see if we can help you. And I also just want to give a little background about us here at MNN. Our three goals are to strengthen the nonprofit sector through advocacy, public awareness, and capacity building services. And as part of those capacity building efforts, we offer webinars along with other programs. So please stay tuned for future webinars coming up and let us know if there's any topics you'd like to see. Our efforts are made possible by more than 600 member organizations. So thank you to those who are members who are on today. And if you have not yet joined the network but want to learn more, just let me know, or you can go to our website as well. So for today's webinar, it's titled Using Client Feedback Data for Fundraising, Strategic Decision-Making, and Advancing Equity. And this presentation is presented by Heidi Elneil of Listen4Good. So I'll now hand it over, Heidi, to get us started.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining today. It's great to meet all of you. Well, to speak with you, I guess. I'm looking forward to getting a chance to chat. And I would like us to get to know each other a little bit before I dive into the topic. But while I'm doing that, let me pull up my screen and share. There we go. Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about engagement and evaluation and equity and how we use feedback to really share our story and to share about the work that we do, as well as to improve the work. But I think we have a chat. Do we have a chat feature here today, Claire?
Yes.
Great. So I would love to kind of know who's in the room. We can see the registrations, but I would still love if you could introduce yourself and so that others can kind of know who's in the room with them. When we open it up to Q&A, I know that'll be helpful. So while I'm chatting, if you put in your name, organization, and where you're located, that would be great, where in the state you are. But also, after or while you do that, I do have a grounding question for us, which is, if you've recently, or when you think about the way that you gather input from your community, how do you find that? How easy or difficult do you find that process? 1 being, it's a really frustrating process. We're not getting the data we want. 5 being, it's a great process. It's smooth. We're getting the information that we want. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 2s and 3s, which is great, right? But that's a good place. That means there's some practice in place. Perhaps there's a survey out in the field that goes out, or we gather some feedback informally. Maybe sometimes that feedback gets to programs or maybe to someone who makes the decision with it. Maybe it's done, but it's onerous, as Miriam just described. So, but there's something in the field, also maybe room to improve. So we'll talk about feedback in a moment. I also want to did I introduce myself? My name is Heidi. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Partner Services at Listen4Good. My role is to be a partner to our nonprofits as they learn, but also to share about feedback generally, because we're a nonprofit. Just thinking about strengthening the sector is really a big part of our mission. By way of background, I mostly worked in youth development before I came to Listen4Good, and I'm actually based, we're a fully remote organization, and I personally am based in Los Angeles. So it's nice to be connected to the East Coast right now. Over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about why and how organizations are using feedback. And then I want to spend some time thinking about effective feedback practices. So really, what are some things for you to keep in mind as you're moving forward in your feedback practices? And then we'll leave time for a Q&A, and then just a brief overview of what is Listen4Good and how do we help organizations advance their feedback. As Claire mentioned you can throw questions into the chat or into the little Q&A box, and I'll be happy to go back to them. I think we'll have a good conversation. So if anything comes up, feel free to write those questions down. So what we find from a lot of the nonprofits that we work with, the organizations that we work with, is that they do have some sort of feedback practice in place. And what we also find is that for a lot of those organizations, they'll go through maybe a survey process and end up with responses in some form. And then that's kind of where the process stops. They've collected the data, maybe they'll analyze it a little bit, they'll review it. But for whatever reason, that data doesn't feel actionable. It doesn't feel as useful as they wanted it to. And so what we know at Listen for Good is that when feedback is actionable, it's an important part of the way that we build our programs, improve our programs, and thus have a greater impact in the work that we're doing. We also know that it's an important part of the work that we do around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's a really powerful tool for storytelling, advocacy, and fundraising. So what I want to do first is just share a few examples of how different organizations use feedback in these different ways. And the first that I want to start with is the Lone Star Circle of Care. So they run health clinics throughout the state of Texas. And as you know, a health clinic, what they're really concerned about is the health of their community, right? That people are living healthy lives. What they did for their Listen for Good project is really think about the experience that their clients were having when they were in their clinic, because they know that if clients have a positive experience in the clinic, then they're more likely to take actions that will lead to those health outcomes that they're looking for, right? A positive experience in the clinic means that they're more likely to follow doctor directives, that they're more likely to come to the doctor again. They're more likely to fill out a prescription and take their medication, right? But it starts with, what is the experience that they're having? So that's what they were assessing with their Listen for Good project. So what they did was they asked questions like, did our staff explain what they were doing and what to expect next? Were you proactively provided updates on your wait time? Did you feel like you were treated with respect when you were in the clinic? What they heard was that some of their clients were rarely, never, or only sometimes experiencing those things. And what they were able to do with that data is to really disaggregate it by location and by experience, right? Or by skill, because it wasn't all locations and it wasn't all skills that they weren't seeing. And so they didn't need to retrain across 18 different health clinics. That would have been very difficult. No need to reboil the ocean. What they're able to do is really provide targeted support to the skills and the clinics that they were seeing the lower satisfaction. And when they provided that retraining, they started seeing in their resurveying, they started seeing their clients replying that they were experiencing these things all of the time, right? This didn't take them, decades of outreach to their community. In a relatively short amount of time, they were able to ensure that their clients were having the experience that they wanted them to have, and thus have a greater impact on their clients and on the work that they were doing. So that's how an organization really thinks about experience and impact. We also know that the way we look at survey data, the way that we analyze survey data, and the way that we act on it is a really important part of our work around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so what I'm showing here is not the health clinic. This is actually a youth serving organization in the Southwest. And this is a population that serves mostly white and Hispanic families. They just, in their community, they have a very small population of Black and multiracial families. And so when they did their initial survey, when they looked at the data in aggregate, they were getting pretty positive client satisfaction results, right? That people were saying they were having pretty good experiences. When they disaggregated by race and ethnicity, they saw that their Black and multiracial families were having a very different experience. And this was something that was hidden when they looked at the data in aggregate. And so one of the things, and I'll talk about this a little bit, but one of the things that's really important is when we're, the Lone Star Circle of Care, they disaggregated by skill and by location. But when we disaggregate by different demographics, we can really think about, are the people having are our different communities having the experience that we want them to have? So they were able, again, to really retarget their staff training and think, how do we now address making sure that Black and multiracial families are feeling treated with respect, are feeling welcomed in our space? When they resurveyed, they actually found that across the board, families of all race and ethnicities reported higher levels of satisfaction after implementing changes, but those changes were targeted at ensuring Black and multiracial families felt included, and it had a positive impact across the board. I just want to take a second to kind of frame the way that we think feedback loops in an equity standpoint. What I'm showing here is our client engagement pyramid. And so you'll see that feedback really provides the base of that. It allows us to gather the most voices, right? And get feedback from as many people as possible. But we also want to think about this is one way of engaging client voice or your volunteer voice or staff voice, the way that you kind of think about it. How do we think about the people that we serve and how do we incorporate their voice throughout the organization? And so this pyramid shows ways of engaging at higher levels, and those are really important and really wonderful. And this is a part of a best practice that we support. And, it's not that the higher up you go, the better or more important it is. In fact, the higher up you go, you're looking at fewer and fewer voices being heard, but those voices are now having real power, which is great. But it's always augmented by that broad base of feedback that allows us to hear as many voices as possible at the same time. So that's equity. Now, we know that feedback is also a really powerful tool for storytelling, advocacy, and fundraising. So I want to share a couple of stories. One is Habitat for Humanity of Greater Memphis, because in addition to the great work that Habitat does, building homes, they have programs to help seniors age in place by retrofitting their homes so that they stay accessible. And when they surveyed this population, what they heard was their clients said, "We do appreciate this. This is great. However, I don't always know how to use the things that you've installed in my home." And so they were able to take this feedback back to their board and back to their funders and advocate for hiring a social worker who could actually help their older residents learn how to use the new modifications to their home, right? Because it's one thing for us to be able to say, here's what staff is identifying as a need. Here's what we think are priorities for funding. Here's what we think are priorities for strategic planning. It's another thing to say, here's what our clients are saying they need. And then being able to respond to those. And we're finding increasingly that funders are asking, how are you listening to your clients? And just from internal conversations we've had with funders are saying, a lot of the time organizations are not answering this question in a way that feels like it's enough. And we know that funders are starting to ask more, right, for client voice. And so we know that being able to share what clients are identifying as a need, what clients are identifying as positives can be really important. We also know that the way that we communicate with our communities and reflect back to them is really important. And for a lot of our nonprofits, clients aren't the only important constituency. For a lot of nonprofits, volunteers are also really powerful partners. And so I want to share an example of Second Helpings Atlanta, who for them, volunteers are critical to the work that they do. Their volunteers drive to pick up food from restaurants and from supermarkets, and then they deliver that food to people who need it. And so they couldn't do the work without their volunteers. And so when they surveyed their volunteers, they asked them, what is it that drives you to do this work? And their volunteers shared that it's about addressing food insecurity, they care about reducing food waste, and they appreciate the flexible scheduling. And so they also asked them, what is it that you want from us? What is it that you want more of? And they said, what we really want is to see the impact that we're having. And so this gave them a really clear directive, right? So in their newsletters to volunteers, in their social media, on their website, they very explicitly started sharing more about the impact that they were having. We know that this is important because for so many of our work, the volunteers are leading the work, and we engage volunteers, I mean that they're volunteers who are staying. Engaged volunteers are more likely to bring new volunteers to join, right? We know it's easier to retain a volunteer than it is to recruit a new one. And long-term volunteers are also an important base for donations. So sharing, right, making sure that we're meeting the needs of the people who we're working with are also important, just like meeting the needs of our clients. So we know that when feedback is actionable and when it's structured in a way that's helpful, it leads to improved experience and thus greater impact. It's one of our important tools in our work around equity, diversity, inclusion, and it can be a really powerful tool for storytelling, advocacy, and fundraising. That's really the why, right? The why and of feedback and why organizations do this. I want to share a little bit now about when you're doing your feedback, what are some best practices that you can keep in mind? The first thing is that when we're thinking about feedback, just broadly, we're often thinking about it as a one-way process. It's really seen as a way of collecting data. It's kind of an extractive process, right? Where we ask questions and now we have what we need. Listen4Good really thinks about feedback as a loop, right? And if you're familiar with a continuous quality improvement plan, this looks very similar. This is what it is with a survey at the center. So feedback is as I said, feedback is a loop. And so as you move through each step, we're really thinking about how do we ensure that we're meeting the people that we serve, that we're getting the data that we need, and also that we're closing the loop. And so I'm going to go into each of these steps. And how do you think, what are some things to think about as you go through it? Because we're really thinking about how do we design a survey that focuses on experience and is really tied to things that we have control over. We're thinking about how do we ensure that the way we collect data is going to lead to a high enough response rate and also a representative response rate, right? And so how do we frame feedback in a way that encourages our community to actually give us feedback? And then how do we interpret that data, right? How do we look at it in order to ensure that we're looking at the experiences of the people we serve? And then how do we use it? How do we make sure that this data is something that doesn't sit in a drawer or on a desktop? And then the last step is probably the most novel for organizations, and it's what we call closing the loop, but it's sharing back what you've heard and what you're going to do with the people that you serve. So as I said, I'm going to go into a little bit of each of these steps and just a best practice to keep in mind as you're going through. So we start with survey design. And when we think about survey design, we're really thinking here about accessibility and making sure that each question is really designed to be easily read. And each question is designed so that it provides you with the data that you need. So we're thinking first about language. Is it designed to be accessible? Can you translate it into the languages of the people that you serve? And also about readability. So our recommendation is typically a standard survey is written at about an 8th grade reading level. But for example, like Listen4Good also has a simplified survey. So how do we make sure that the language, we think about the community that we serve and we make sure the language makes sense to who we're serving? Also really crucial is how long does it take to complete? So the Listen4Good survey is maximum 20 questions, but we actually recommend that a survey is no longer than 15 questions. You want to ensure that your clients can complete a survey in less than 5 minutes. Anything longer than that, and people are not going to be answering those final questions. And we really, again, want to ensure that the questions are actionable, as in when you get that data, are you going to understand what to do with it? And is it tied to something you have control over? We're not collecting feedback data. We're not collecting data for data's sake. We're collecting feedback data so that we can have an impact on the work that we're completing. So that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about survey design. Once we have our survey, then it's about how do we get it into our community? How do we collect those responses and how do we monitor those responses so that we're getting the representation that we want? And how do we think about minimizing courtesy bias, right? So how do we make sure that people are actually giving us feedback and not just letting us know that everything is fine? So a couple of things to keep in mind is that a really important part here is not just putting a survey out in the field. It's about the communication that we have with our audience before they receive the survey. So how we frame and how we message our survey is really critical. So we always want to be really clear that completing or not completing the survey has no bearing on access to services, that it's not a requirement. Really important that if it's an anonymous survey, that we share that, this is anonymous, this isn't going to be connected to you. Or if it's not an anonymous survey, being really clear about how confidential the data is, how that data is going to be used, who has access to that data. Also important to let people know that we're going to let them know what we heard. If you're going to do that, though, it's also very important that you then let them know what you heard. And being very clear about the purpose of collecting this information, right? That it's about getting feedback on your work so that you can improve your work, so you can meet their needs. And it's not about, getting anyone in trouble. It's not about, knowing it, just being really clear that it's about feedback and it is about being able to better serve the community. That's crucial. Once we've This is why relationships are such an important part. And so thinking about who is out there in the community talking, who's connected to your community members, and thinking about how can you leverage relationships as a way of gathering feedback can also be a really important part of thinking through your process. So it's worth pausing before you put a survey out in the field and thinking about how are people hearing about the survey. There are lots of different ways to kind of prepare your community to be able to take this survey. So some organizations will do flyers. I love the example well, it's my right. I think it might also be your right. The Girls Voice Week. So these are young women who are encouraging their peers to take the survey. And so really thinking again about how do you leverage people's relationships to encourage survey collection. I love these images. So once we have those responses, it's really about how do we interpret the results. So a few things. One, how do you identify the things that are going really well? I think for so many people, a lot of anxiety around staff doing surveys and things like that is because they're concerned with the ramifications of getting negative feedback. I think that people tend to underestimate actually how much good work they're doing. And so a lot of feedback tends to be positive. And so how do we ensure that we're highlighting the things that we're doing well so that we can continue to do it and so that we can grow those bright spots? But then also here is where we're really thinking about disaggregation and we're really thinking about client experience and different demographics. So when we're doing survey analysis, it's really important to think about what are the different segments that make sense to the work that you do and to the audience that you serve to look across the board. So some of the ways that you can think about really segmenting data. Mention Lone Star, segmenting by location and by skill. Um, you can segment by program. You can also segment by if you are offering surveys in different languages, thinking about comparing those different surveys and how are Spanish speakers rating us versus English speakers, for example. So that's one way to think about it. So by language. Another way, obviously race and ethnicity, but also gender, by age, right? Are we meeting all of if we have serve a large range of different ages, or even within a smaller age? I've seen, for organizations who serve seniors, for example, right? Maybe their younger seniors are having a different experience than even older seniors. So really thinking about what are the different age ranges and the different experiences that make sense to our population and to the work that we're doing. So not just aggregating data, but disaggregating data is a really important practice here. Once we have developed those insights, once we kind of create some of those narratives and that story that we've found in the data, it is so important to then respond to that feedback. So many organizations, they focus in on those 1 through 3, and then 4 and 5 are really where that data collection breaks. That's kind of a stop there. So important, again, that we're not collecting data for data's sake. So when we're thinking about how do we respond to feedback, one thing to really think about is how do we present this data to different stakeholders? Because we might want to present data that we're sharing to program staff differently than we're sharing it to the board, for example, right? So it's really what feels relevant to these different groups, and how do we present this data in a way that feels sticky for them? We also really want to think about how do we prioritize those things that feel like low-hanging fruit, the things that we can do right away? The simple things, but that allow us to get started on responding to that feedback. That part is really important because our next part is closing the loop. So when we're thinking about closing the loop, it's about communicating what we've heard and what we're doing to the people who took the survey, but also to the community at large. Closing the loop is a really critical part of this process. What it does is it takes data from being an extractive process, a data collection from an extractive process, to one that's really about relationships and that's really about trust. This is where we tell our community, hey, we really value the time that you took and we value your opinions. Here's what you shared with us and what we're doing with that. And our best practice here is simply to do it. Just make sure that in whatever way you communicate with your population, that you are closing the loop with them. So if you have client meetings, it can be as simple as including this in client meetings. If you see people in person, right, then how do you put something in the space that they're in that lets them know if you're meeting them? If you tend to communicate through newsletters, right? How do you include this in your newsletter? How do you have this on your website? Just really thinking about what do we already have in place? You don't need to build anything new. What do you already have in place to communicate with the people that you serve or with your audiences? And how do you use this to close the loop? So I just wanted to share this. This is a really great example of an organization that provides meals and housing. And so what you see here was actually printed out and put as a placemat on the tables when people were having a meal. So really creative and simple way, ultimately, to close the loop with their population. Another example that I really love is going back to Second Helpings Atlanta. I mentioned a little bit about how they close the loop with their clients, but another thing that they did, which I just love this example, when they surveyed their volunteers, what they found was that their average volunteer drive time was 90 minutes. And so what they did was they just created a playlist for their volunteers. And they said, hey, we really value your time. Here's something we made for you. And they just included that in their Closing the Loop newsletter. Um, I think that was just such a cool way of sharing back some information and letting their volunteers know how much they value their volunteers' time. So I love that example. So those are some things to keep in mind kind of as you're going through this process. So Listen4Good has a capacity, is a program to help organizations do this. So I'm going to share a little bit now about what Listen4Good is, what are the resources available to help get you through this process. So as I mentioned, we offer capacity building programs to organizations to build their skills around creating sustainable listening cultures, of developing their skills in that feedback loop with a real focus on equity and how do we ensure that the voices of those who are least heard are included in our organization. We've been in operation around 8 years, and we're a fully remote organization. And in that time, as of this summer, we've supported over 1,000 nonprofits and organizations across the country. I mentioned fully remote, so we're able to meet people where they are. And so we're really, we've had some great partnerships across the country, and we're always really excited to expand these bubbles. And we work with a variety of different types of organizations. So probably the bulk of the organizations we serve are kind of direct service nonprofits, but we also work with the public sector, like states and cities, and then with capacity building partners as well. So our goal here is to strengthen feedback across the sector. And the way that we do that is by providing we provide three main pillars of support for an organization. So the first is through self-guided tools. So we have an online web app that's integrated with a premium survey account. And the goal of this tool is really to make the technical parts of surveying really accessible, to give you the resources that you need to do it efficiently and effectively, and to put it all in one place. So there's no more need to kind of Google and DIY and cobble together surveys. Everything you need to go step by step through the process is in one place. We also offer group learning opportunities. So it's a self-paced program, but we work on a cohort model, which means that most organizations tend to be hitting similar parts and steps of the survey at the same time. So we offer live webinars so that you can connect with nonprofits who are going through the process alongside you. And we tend to have about a little under 100 organizations in each cohort. So a lot of opportunity to connect with like-minded organizations and with similar types of organizations as well. And then we offer coaching. So we have a pool of coaches who are available to help move you through this process. All of our coaches are nonprofit practitioners and experts in survey methodology. And so they're really taking their broad base of understanding with their experience in nonprofits and their experience coaching different nonprofits and targeting it to this specific lens. So depending on which program you are, that really changes the type of coaching that's available. So let me talk about kind of the program offerings really quickly. They're more similar than they are dissimilar. So each of our programs for new organizations are 18 months long. You get the same SurveyMonkey, you get the same online web app experience, you get the same webinar experience. There's kind of two differences. Our premium program provides very extensive coaching. So you are paired with a coach who really helps guide you step by step through every step of the process. They provide what I would almost call like some very light project management, helping you ensure that you're meeting your goals and your timeline. So that has more extensive coaching. Online Plus is more of a self-directed program. So you have all of the online resources, and then you have targeted coaching at key steps. You'll notice that, we're looking at somewhere between 12 to 15 hours a year versus 3 hours a year. The other thing that Premium has is we have survey templates for volunteers, staff, partners, and community, as well as a client survey. Online Plus is really a client survey focused program. So if you're looking for something that's a little more self-directed, you think you don't need as intensive coaching, and you're really only looking to survey clients, Online Plus can be a really good opportunity for self-pay organizations. And that cost is $2,500 for the 18-month program. Premium is $7,500. That is the cost of a nonprofit who is choosing to self-pay for the program. Most organizations who participate in Listen for Good are actually sponsored by a funder, and so funders pay a different cost when they're doing that. But if you're paying for it yourself, then those are the costs. But if cost is a barrier, as I mentioned, most organizations don't pay, and we're always happy to have a conversation and try to help identify a funder who may be willing to sponsor, or if that's not a possibility and a lot of organizations apply for grants to cover this cost. We have a grant template language to help you make that process a little bit easier. Okay, that's actually all the information that I have for you right now, because I want to give enough time for questions. And then if those questions come up with other things, I do have other prepared slides that may feel relevant. But I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment so that people can throw questions in the chat or in the Q&A. It's not a huge, yeah, so let's do it that way. So chat or like the Q&A function. Do you have any insights? Thanks, Dana. Do you have any insight on continued surveying, like a check-in survey for participants in our nonprofit programs a year or even a few years later? That's a great question. So what we know is that those things are really difficult. It's hard to get high response rates from people that have completed the program and kind of don't have a continued relationship. Also, if you're trying to track graduation, school completion rates, that's great data to collect. That's also not necessarily feedback data, right? That has nothing to do with your programs, maybe necessarily specifically. But here's what we'll say. The highest collection response rates are going to be with people who you still have relationships with. So one thing to think like long-term is, how do you maintain some form of relationship so that they're more likely to complete a survey? And kind of with that is, who does it make sense? Usually when you're doing something like this, we're thinking about an email survey. And something as simple as whose name is the email coming from can make a difference in response rates. So if it's a generic name or someone they don't know, people are less likely to actually complete a survey. So also think, if this was an organization where someone maybe had a mentor or a connection, can that person send the email? We do find that tends to have a good impact on response rates. Typically, when we're looking at alumni surveying, the hardest part is going to be those response rates. But when it comes to something like survey design, we also want to think about, how can you tie those things back to the experience that they had with you, if we're going to think about it in like a feedback frame. So if you're going to tie back something like graduation completion rates, right? Thinking about what were the things that they experienced, can they think back to the experiences that they had with you that may have helped them, or what would have helped them, right? Moving forward. Was that helpful? Great. While you all are thinking about that, then maybe I will share a couple more slides, and that might spur some more questions. So I mentioned it's an 18-month program. So let me show you the timeline and what that looks like. So for organizations who, it's 18 months because a typical organization gets through a survey in about 6 to 9 months. The program is 18 months, so you could potentially do multiple loops. It is self-paced. So depending on which, how the capacity of your organization, what makes sense for you. This can look very different for each organization, but this kind of gives you an example. For most organizations who are starting in Listen for Good's January program, which is our next cohort starts January 2025, you can expect to have a survey out in the field in about the spring or maybe even early summer. For our next cohort after that starts in July. For organizations who start in the July cohort, you'll tend to find they have a survey out in the fall or maybe the winter. So thinking about that cadence that makes sense for your organization can kind of help you identify which cohort, if you're thinking about Listen for Good, which cohort might be more helpful. Let me just share another slide, and then I'll get to this question that Maureen, you just asked. We Listen for Good also has some pretty core questions that are really important to our methodology. And so these are required questions. And so what you're seeing here is the client survey. And we ask a question about how is it that you would recommend. That gives you the net promoter score. So you have a baseline that you can compare, a benchmark really that you can compare your organization to similar organizations as well as to yourself over time. And then we ask about what is it good at? What could you do better? But we ask about needs being met and then about respect. And then we also ask those demographic questions. These are kind of your initial direction setting questions. These allow you to do that initial analysis and actually develop actionable feedback. I mentioned we also have volunteer partner staff and community surveys. That community survey is really like a community needs assessment. Let me answer, I'll stop there and answer Maureen's question. Do you have a recommendation for survey length when staff or board and not clients? That's a great question, and it's actually the same recommendation. You still keep surveys short. So our templates are the same length, no matter who you're surveying. Similarly, people just get tired of taking surveys. Survey fatigue is a real, even for staff and board. And what's as important, so length and everything like that is really, really important. But the way that we think about that is really thinking about how do we ask questions and how do we ensure that those questions are going to get us the data that we want. So it's not about, it's really about starting with what is it that we need to know? And then how do we develop questions to get at those things, right? So you don't start with the question, you start with your goals. So that's one thing to really think about. There was something else I wanted to add there. Oh, right. And how do we make sure that questions are not duplicative, right? And so oftentimes we find that if you were to think about what the response that you would get from a question, if it feels similar to another question you're asking, you toss it. So really about pairing, you have to really review those surveys and those questions over again to really ensure, okay, does this question sound anything or feel anything like we're going to get the same data? We would get the same data from this question as another question. You got to be willing to pair back those questions. These are great questions, by the way. Keep them coming. I enjoy this part of the process. Then let me also share one more slide. When Listen for Good, in our registration form, we ask for 2 roles. And so really the goal here is to help you think about capacity. Because even for organizations who are being sponsored by a funder, right? So maybe they don't no longer have to consider, how are they, putting their funds into this, but we know that staff capacity is one of the most precious resources that our nonprofits have. And this is a big part of ensuring that you can actually do feedback effectively. So when we ask for your registration, we think about 2 roles. One is the project manager and one is the project champion. The project manager is really the person who is leading the survey on the day-to-day. They're also the main contact for Listen4Good. And the project champion is the person in leadership who can really make feedback a priority. And this is really important when it comes to how do we respond to the feedback, right? So how can you ensure that the organization is responding to the feedback? Sometimes this is the same person playing both roles. Sometimes they're different. But we find that on average, in order to get through an effective feedback loop, it takes about 70 hours a year, right? So we're looking, or more. So we're looking at about 8 to 10 hours of one person's time. Um, so that's actually more, right? We're looking at about somewhere between 80 and 100 hours a year to do this effectively. And so this is not the time that you're just taking with Listen4Good. This includes all of the time that it takes to develop a survey, to get it out in the field, to monitor those responses, to do the analysis, to share the responses back. All of that takes time. So really thinking about when does your staff and who on your staff has the capacity to do this work is really important, because one of our recommendations is when people ask like, well, how often should I survey? Right? How often should I have a survey out in the field? The response is, how often can you do something about it? Right? So survey, if it's yearly, you can respond to the survey and make changes. That's great. If you're working on, every other year, thinking about how do you build this into your timeline and how do you actually have staff capacity to do the work can be really important to keep in mind. And also thinking about who are you involving in the process and how can you maybe involve more than one person, because we know that staff transitions happen, and we want to ensure that this capacity is built in more than one person so that we don't lose all of that work and all that knowledge when one person leaves. So I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes, but in Claire's follow-up email, you'll have my contact info. So feel free to book a call with me or to just send me an email with any questions. Happy to connect and answer questions that way. Oh, how would you describe running a feedback loop in a job description? Madison, that's a fantastic question. Um, I don't have a particular answer for you. I wouldn't use the term feedback loop because that is, about that's just like an internal Listen4Good term. But having something about gathering and use, I mean, I would say something about like the steps of a feedback loop, right? You want someone to be able to create a survey. So someone who has some knowledge or experience in survey design, in analysis. The response is really project management or collaboration. That's probably the way that I would address it. I'm trying to think. Listen4Good is currently hiring coaches. So I'm trying to think, how do we describe it in our um, I'd be happy to share kind of how we think about it in our job descriptions, even though we don't really run very much feedback. That's a great question. I will also just like do a quick plug. For after organizations complete Listen4Good, they become eligible for Listen4Good Advanced, which is new programming that we just launched this summer. And one of our programs, Amplifying Feedback Across Your Organization, has an entire piece just on that, answering that question. We think a lot in advanced about how do we make champions, feedback champions out of everyone in the organization. And in fact, one of the resources that we've created is how do you ensure that using feedback is in everyone's job description. So that is something we're really starting to think about. And I'd happy if you want to just connect with me via email. I'd be happy to like look through what resources we might have available and share that with you. Okay. As I said, I'm willing to stay on a couple more minutes, but Claire, you're good. I think we can give people their time back. Thank you all so much. Really, it was great seeing you. Claire, do you have any like closing things that you wanted to share?
No, just a reminder that I'll be sending out the follow-up email. And thank you to you, Heidi, for sharing this with everyone. It seemed like really great content, so we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I look forward to connecting with everyone in a different internet space.
Great, yes. Well, Everyone have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining us.